Borders disappear, but names sometimes remain. In ancient maps scattered across forgotten archives and dusty collections, one word keeps appearing again and again, stretching across vast portions of the known world: Tartary. Not as a minor region, but as something immense, so large it almost defies explanation. And that raises a disturbing question: how does something that big simply lose its borders, and then its identity? Today we follow the traces of that disappearance, and what we find may not be as simple as it seems. For centuries, maps were more than tools for navigation. They were interpretations of reality, shaped by the knowledge, assumptions, and limitations of their creators. When cartographers drew the world, they weren't just recording geography, they were defining it. And in that process, certain regions became exaggerated, simplified, or grouped under names that didn't necessarily reflect political realities as we understand them today. Tartary was one of those names. Across European maps from the 16th to the 18th centuries, Tartary appears as a massive expanse covering much of northern Asia. It stretches from the edges of Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Sometimes it is labeled in different forms: Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. But the message remains consistent. This was a region of enormous scale, vaguely defined yet undeniably present. But what exactly did it represent? To understand that, we need to step into the mindset of the people who created these maps. For many European cartographers, the interior of Asia was largely unknown. Information came from fragmented travel accounts, second-hand reports, and occasional diplomatic contact. Instead of detailed political borders, what they had were general impressions: vast lands inhabited by various groups often described collectively as Tartars. The term itself did not refer to a single unified empire. It was a broad label used by Europeans to describe different nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples spread across Central and Northern Asia. These included Turkic groups, Mongols, and others whose cultures and territories were diverse and constantly shifting. But from a distance, these distinctions blurred together, and Tartary became a convenient way to label the unknown. Still, that doesn't fully explain the scale. Why was Tartary shown as something so massive, often rivaling or exceeding entire continents in size? Part of the answer lies in the absence of precise data. When mapmakers lacked detailed information, they often filled in the gaps with generalized regions. Instead of drawing dozens of smaller territories, they would assign a single name to an entire area. In this sense, Tartary was not just a place. It was a placeholder for everything that wasn't fully understood. But there is another layer to this story. As exploration expanded and knowledge improved, the way maps represented Tartary began to change. Borders became more defined. New names appeared: Russia, China, Mongolia, Central Asia, each carving out pieces of what was once labeled as a single vast region. Gradually, the word Tartary started to fade. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, unfolding over decades as empires expanded and scientific cartography advanced. The Russian Empire pushed eastward, mapping Siberia with increasing precision. The Qing dynasty consolidated control over vast territories in Asia. European explorers and diplomats brought back more accurate information. And with each new map, the need for a broad, ambiguous label like Tartary diminished. What's fascinating is not just that Tartary disappeared, but how quietly it happened. There was no single moment where cartographers decided to erase it. No official declaration that the name was no longer valid. Instead, it simply stopped being used, replaced by more specific terms that reflected the growing complexity of global geography. Yet when we look back at those older maps, the contrast is striking. One moment, Tartary dominates entire regions of the world. The next, it's gone, fragmented into dozens of smaller, clearly defined territories. It creates the illusion that something massive has been lost, when in reality, what changed was the way the world was understood and represented. This is where modern interpretations begin to diverge. Some see the disappearance of Tartary as evidence of a forgotten empire, a hidden chapter of history that has been deliberately erased. Others argue that it was never a true political entity to begin with, but rather a convenient label born from limited knowledge. The truth, as often happens, likely lies somewhere in between, shaped by both misunderstanding and evolution. Because maps are not neutral. They reflect the perspectives of their creators, the power structures of their time, and the limits of human knowledge. When those factors change, the maps change too. Borders shift, names evolve, and entire regions can appear or disappear, not because the land itself has changed, but because our understanding of it has. And Tartary is one of the most striking examples of that phenomenon. If you trace the evolution of these maps carefully, a pattern begins to emerge. Early representations are broad, almost impressionistic. Tartary appears as a sweeping label across lands that were distant, inaccessible, and largely mysterious to European observers. But as time moves forward, the lines begin to sharpen. Rivers are drawn more accurately. Mountain ranges take clearer shape. Cities appear where before there had only been empty space. And with each refinement, the massive, undefined expanse of Tartary begins to fracture. What was once a single name starts to split into many. Siberia becomes distinctly Russian. Central Asia is divided into khanats, and later into territories influenced or controlled by expanding empires. Regions that had once been grouped together under a vague identity are now given individual names, each tied to specific political or cultural realities. The transformation is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable unless you compare maps side by side. But over time, it becomes undeniable. This process reflects a broader shift in how knowledge was gathered and organized. The age of exploration brought not just new lands into view, but new standards for accuracy. Cartography evolved from an art based on interpretation into a science grounded in measurement. Longitude and latitude became more precise. Expeditions were sent not just to discover, but to document. And as the blank spaces on the map began to disappear, so did the need for generalized labels like Tartary. But even as the name faded from official use, it lingered in the margins of history. Old atlases preserved its memory. Travelers' accounts continued to reference it, sometimes long after it had begun to vanish from newer maps. It became, in a sense, a ghost of geography, no longer part of the present but not entirely gone either. This lingering presence is part of what makes Tartary so intriguing today. When modern viewers encounter these old maps, they see something that feels inconsistent with the world they know. A massive region, clearly labeled, seemingly significant, and yet absent from contemporary understanding. It creates a tension between what is seen and what is known, and that tension invites questions. Were the mapmakers wrong? Did they exaggerate the scale of Tartary due to lack of information? Or were they capturing something that later became obscured as political boundaries shifted and narratives changed? These questions don't have simple answers, but they reveal something important about how we interpret the past. Because it's easy to assume that older maps are less accurate, that they represent a primitive understanding of the world. And in many ways, that's true. But it's also true that they capture perspectives that have since been lost. They show us how people once conceptualized vast regions of the earth, how they grouped cultures and territories into categories that made sense within their own frameworks. In the case of Tartary, that framework was shaped by distance and limited contact. To a European cartographer, the differences between various Central Asian and Siberian peoples might have seemed minor compared to their shared unfamiliarity. Grouping them under a single name was not necessarily an attempt to mislead. It was a reflection of what could be reasonably understood at the time. At the same time, we cannot ignore the role of power in shaping maps. As empires expanded, they imposed their own systems of naming and division onto the territories they controlled. Russian expansion into Siberia brought not only military and political control, but also a new way of mapping the region. Chinese influence did the same in other parts of Asia. Over time, these more localized and specific identities replaced the broad, external label of Tartary. This raises an interesting possibility that the disappearance of Tartary was not just about increased accuracy, but also about a shift in perspective, from an outsider's generalized view to a more detailed, internally defined one. In other words, Tartary didn't vanish because the land changed, but because the lens through which it was viewed became more focused. And yet, the sense of mystery remains. When you look at a centuries-old map and see Tartary dominating the landscape, it's hard not to feel that something significant has been reduced, simplified, or perhaps even forgotten. The scale alone suggests importance. It hints at a world that was once perceived very differently from our own. This is where modern curiosity often turns into speculation. Some interpretations suggest that Tartary was a unified civilization of immense size and influence, later erased or fragmented by historical forces. Others see it as a misunderstanding that has been amplified by the visual impact of old maps. The truth, again, is likely more nuanced. What we do know is that the people who lived across these regions were real, diverse, and dynamic. They formed networks of trade, culture, and movement that spanned enormous distances. The Silk Road, for example, connected east and west through many of the lands labeled as Tartary. These were not empty spaces. They were active, interconnected parts of the world. But the way those connections were represented depended heavily on who was doing the mapping. To some, these lands were a patchwork of distinct societies. To others, they were a single, vast unknown. And that difference in perspective is what gave rise to the idea of Tartary as something so large and undefined. As we continue to examine these maps, one thing becomes clear. The disappearance of Tartary's borders is not a single event, but a gradual transformation. It is the result of exploration, expansion, and the constant refinement of knowledge. It reflects the shift from a world of broad assumptions to one of detailed understanding. And yet, in that transformation, something was inevitably lost. Not a hidden empire, but a way of seeing the world that embraced its unknowns rather than dividing them into precise categories. There is a moment when comparing these maps across time where the shift becomes almost unsettling, not because something clearly defined is erased, but because something vague is slowly forced into clarity. The large, almost mythical presence of Tartary begins to dissolve into borders, names, and political identities that feel more familiar to us today. But in that process, the imagination that once filled those spaces seems to disappear as well. What once stood as a symbol of the unknown becomes fragmented into pieces that are easier to categorize, easier to control, and easier to explain. The vastness that defined Tartary is reduced, not physically, but conceptually. It's no longer a sweeping expanse of mystery. It becomes a collection of territories, each with its own label, each fitting neatly into the growing framework of modern geography. And this is where the idea of disappearing borders takes on a deeper meaning. Because the borders of Tartary were never fixed lines to begin with, they weren't drawn with precision, nor were they enforced by a single governing authority. They were fluid, interpretative, shaped by the limits of knowledge rather than by political reality. So when they disappeared, it wasn't a matter of erasure, it was a matter of replacement. Precise borders replaced imagined ones. Documented territories replaced generalized regions. The unknown was gradually mapped, measured, and named. And as that happened, the need for a concept like Tartary simply faded away. But even with this explanation, something about it continues to provoke curiosity. Because when we look at those old maps, we're not just seeing geography, we're seeing a worldview, a way of organizing the planet that allowed for ambiguity, that acknowledged vast areas as uncertain, even mysterious. Modern maps, for all their accuracy, leave very little room for that kind of interpretation. Everything now has a name. Everything has coordinates, the blank spaces are gone. And perhaps that's part of why Tartary captures so much attention today. It represents one of the last echoes of a time when the world was not fully known, when large portions of it existed more as ideas than as clearly defined places. It reminds us that knowledge is not static, it evolves, and in doing so, it reshapes how we perceive both the past and the present. At the same time, it's important to remain grounded in what evidence actually supports. There is no historical consensus that Tartary was a single, unified empire, with centralized control over the vast lands it occupied on maps. Instead, The evidence points toward a collection of diverse cultures and societies that were grouped together under a single name by outsiders who lacked detailed information. That doesn't make the concept meaningless. On the contrary, it makes it a powerful example of how human understanding works. Faced with complexity and limited data, we simplify. We create categories. We assign names that help us make sense of what we don't fully understand. Tartary was one of those categories, and over time, as understanding improved, that category became unnecessary. But the transition from ignorance to knowledge is rarely clean. It leaves behind traces, artifacts like maps that capture moments in the evolution of human perception. When we look at them now, we're seeing not just the world as it was believed to be, but the process by which that belief changed. This is why the disappearance of Tartary's borders can feel so dramatic, even though it was gradual. Because we're not witnessing a physical transformation, we're witnessing a conceptual one, a shift in how reality itself was organized and represented. And yet, the questions persist. Why did some maps continue to use the term long after more accurate information was available? Why did the name vary so much? Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, if it was purely a placeholder? And why does its scale seem so consistently exaggerated across different sources? These inconsistencies leave room for interpretation, and where interpretation exists, so does speculation. Some argue that the persistence of the name suggests a deeper significance, something that wasn't easily replaced by newer knowledge. Others believe it simply reflects the slow spread of information in a time before instant communication, where outdated ideas could remain in circulation for decades. Both perspectives highlight an important truth. History is not just a collection of facts. It's a process of interpretation, shaped by the availability of information and the perspectives of those who record it. And in that process, certain ideas can take on a life of their own. Tartary is one of those ideas. Not because it was a hidden superpower erased from history, but because it represents the intersection of knowledge and uncertainty. It shows us what happens when vast regions of the world are observed from a distance, filtered through limited understanding, and then translated into something that feels concrete, even when it isn't. As the modern world took shape, there was less and less room for that kind of ambiguity. Scientific methods demanded precision. Political systems demanded clearly defined borders. And global communication ensured that information spread more quickly and consistently than ever before. In that environment, a concept like Tartary could not survive. It wasn't erased, it became obsolete. But its legacy remains, preserved in the maps that once gave it form. And every time someone encounters those maps for the first time, the same question tends to arise. How could something so large simply disappear? The answer, as we've seen, is both simpler and more complex than it appears. It didn't disappear in the way we might imagine. It transformed, gradually breaking apart as knowledge expanded and perspectives shifted. Still, there is one final layer to consider, one that goes beyond maps and into the way we think about history itself. In the end, the story of Tartary is not about a lost empire hidden from history, but about the way history itself is constructed. What appears, at first glance, to be the disappearance of something vast and powerful is, in reality, the transformation of human understanding. The borders didn't vanish overnight. They were never truly fixed to begin with. They existed as approximations, shaped by distance, uncertainty, and the limits of knowledge. As exploration expanded and information became more precise, those broad interpretations were replaced by detailed realities. Tartary didn't collapse. It was gradually redefined, divided into the regions, nations, and identities we recognize today. What once seemed like a single entity was revealed to be something far more complex and diverse. But the reason this mystery continues to capture attention is not because of what Tartary was, it's because of what it represents. It is a reminder that maps are not perfect reflections of the world, but snapshots of how people understood it at a given moment in time. They carry assumptions, gaps, and perspectives that can change dramatically as knowledge evolves. And maybe that's the most important takeaway. When we look at the past, especially through artifacts like ancient maps, We're not just uncovering forgotten places, we're uncovering forgotten ways of thinking. Tartary challenges us to question what we accept as fixed, to recognize that even the most established views of the world were once uncertain, incomplete, and open to interpretation. So the next time you see an old map where Tartary stretches across continents, take a moment to look beyond the borders. Because what you're really seeing isn't just geography, it's the edge of human knowledge, frozen in time.